Morning, everyone. How y'all doing? Good. Good. Go ahead and open up your Bible, Daniel chapter 6. Daniel chapter 6 is where the study is going to be from this morning. As Aaron said, I believe last time he preached, we're going to continue fall focus just a little bit and talk just a little bit more about this idea of being exiles in Babylon. I've got a couple more ideas, but you'll at least get this one, Daniel in the lion's den. This is a very familiar story. So in this lesson, what we're going to try and do is we're going to try to remove some of the vegetation that has sort of popped up around this story. You know, Daniel in the lion's den is a very popular story. And since it's so popular, it's become a children's story. And it's become so popular as a children's story that it even made it into the little series VeggieTales, where, you know, you've got these little vegetables pretending to be Bible characters and retelling the story. And there's nothing wrong with VeggieTales, but the problem is if I'm an adult and I only have a VeggieTales understanding of Daniel chapter 6, there's more there. There's more there. Daniel 6, as Jeff reminded us, really, the book of Daniel is a book. It's not just a book of stories for children. It's a book for adults as well. And so in this lesson, we're going to try and remove some of that vegetation just a little bit and see some of the lessons that Daniel 6 has for us as adults. And so let's jump into the text. We'll actually begin in chapter 5, towards the end of chapter 5, verse 30. Chapter 5, in verse 30. It says, "On that very night, Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans, was killed, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom at the age of 62. Darius decided to appoint 120 satraps over the kingdom, stationed throughout the realm, and over them 3 administrators, including Daniel. These satraps would be accountable to them so that the king would not be defrauded. Daniel distinguished himself above the administrators and satraps because he had an extraordinary spirit, so the king planned to set him over the whole realm. The administrators and satraps, therefore, kept trying to find a charge against Daniel regarding the kingdom, but they could find no charge or corruption, for he was trustworthy, and no negligence or corruption was found in him." And so there we see sort of the first miracle in Daniel, chapter 6 anyway. The first miracle in Daniel chapter 6 is we have this politician who's not corrupt, and they could find no corruption against him. And so we continue reading. Verse 5, it says, "Then these men said, 'We will never find any charge against this Daniel unless we find something against him concerning the law of his God.' So the administrators and satraps went together to the king and said, 'May King Darius live forever.' All the administrators of the kingdom, the prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors, they've all agreed that the king should establish an ordinance and enforce an edict that for 30 days anyone who petitions any god or man except you, the king, will be thrown into the lion's den." And so these men go to the king and they say, "Hey, king, we want to turn you essentially into God. You are the only mediator between God and man. And so if someone wants to petition the gods, they have to go through you first." And so they say, "You essentially are God for a while." And they almost make it sound like Daniel's involved in this. All of the satraps, all of your rulers have decided that this is a good idea. Verse 8. "Therefore, your majesty, establish the edict and sign the document so that as a law of the Medes and Persians, it is irrevocable and cannot be changed." So King Darius signed the written edict. When Daniel learned that the document had been signed, he went to his house. The windows in its upstairs room opened towards Jerusalem, and 3 times a day he got down on his knees, prayed, and gave thanks to his God, just as he had done before. And so what we see as we jump into the first section of this story is that this story really begins with a lot of hope. I mean, think about it. We look at the beginning of this chapter and it says Darius. And so what does that mean? Well, that means Babylon is gone. The arrogant kingdom and the arrogant kings of Babylon, they are all gone, and a new regime has taken hold. And this regime, they were pretty nice to the Israelites. As a matter of fact, since Darius is on the scene and since the Babylonians are no more, what that ultimately means is that the Israelites get to go home pretty soon. As a matter of fact, we see that in chapter 9. Go to chapter 9 real quick of Daniel. Chapter 9, picking up in verse 1, it reads, "In the first year of who? There he goes. In the first year of Darius, the son of, so that's the same king we've just been talking about. In the first king of Darius, the son of Ahasuerus, a Mede by birth, who was made king over the Chaldean kingdom. In the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, understood from the books, according to the word of the Lord to the prophet Jeremiah, that the number of years for the desolation of Jerusalem would be 70. And so we see things are sort of looking good. The Persians like the Israelites. The Israelites are going to get to go home soon. The Babylonians, the wicked and arrogant Babylonians are gone. And not only that, but Daniel is placed in charge of the kingdom. As a matter of fact, that's the king's plan. His plan is to place Daniel in charge of the whole realm to make sure that everything runs smoothly. And so it seems like things are looking up for God's people. But then we continue reading, and we realize, well, not really. As I was reading this, it kind of reminded me a little bit of Home Alone. I think it's the second Home Alone where Marv gets to like this top floor, and he's like, Harry, I've reached the top. And then if you watch the movie, he takes like another step and falls 2 stories and, probably dies, but he doesn't really die. They should have died, what they went through in Home Alone. But it kind of reminds me of that because things are looking so good. But then we continue to read and we see that things really are the same as they were in Babylon. I mean, think about it. Think about all of the things that we've seen so far that sound like what we've already read in Daniel. In this chapter, we see that everyone is supposed to worship the king as God. Where did we see that before? Daniel chapter 3. Back in Babylon. In this chapter, we see that a righteous man ignores the king's edict and continues to worship God anyway, and refuses to worship the king as God. Where do we see that? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Daniel chapter 3. It's back again. We saw it back in Babylon. In this chapter, we see that jealous men go to the king and sort of rat out the man of God, just like happened in Daniel chapter 3. In Daniel chapter 3, some of the people go to the king and they say, there are some Jews who you appointed as rulers, and they aren't listening to you. They've ignored you. So what are you going to do, king? And then finally, in this chapter, we see God's man punished for not worshiping the king. Does that sound familiar? Where did we see that before? We saw it in Daniel chapter 3. You see, Daniel 6 really is a retelling of Daniel chapter 6. What Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego go through in Daniel 3, Daniel goes through here in this chapter. But why? Why? Out of all the stories in Daniel's life, why does the Holy Spirit decide to put these stories here? I think there's an important lesson for us. And the lesson is that even though Daniel is not in Babylon anymore, Babylon's gone, the arrogant kings of Babylon are gone, now Daniel is under Persian rule, but really he's still in Babylon, really. And I think that was an important lesson for them. Because as I said earlier, Persia was not hostile to the Jews. Persia allowed the Jews to go home. Go home, rebuild your city, rebuild your temple. God had blessed the Israelites with Persian approval. He had blessed them with favor among the Persians. And so Daniel and other Jews might be tempted to think, okay, it's all downhill from here. It's going to be easy to serve God now. Because the Persians, they like us. We have favor with them. So it's easy to serve God now. And what we see in this chapter is, no, really, it's all the same. There came a time where Daniel had to let go of human approval, had to let go of human favor, had to not worry about fitting in with everybody else, and to decide to follow God anyway. Well, because it's always Babylon. As a matter of fact, let's skip ahead just a little bit to verse 13 of Daniel chapter 6. And let's think about how the rulers viewed Daniel. Verse 13, when they're writing Daniel out to the king, it says, "Then they replied to the king, Daniel," how do they describe him? Yeah, Daniel, one of the exiles, one of the Judean exiles. To them, it doesn't matter that Daniel is a ruler along with them, that Daniel is soon to be their boss. No. Daniel, one of the exiles, isn't listening to you. And so the way that other people view Daniel, well, he's still in exile. See, really, Daniel is still in Babylon. And so that's the lesson for us. It's always Babylon. It's something that Jeff reminded us of the other day, but I wanted to come back and revisit it. I think that's something we need to remember because we live in America, right? Christian nation. And we seem to sort of distance ourselves from stories like this. Daniel 6 can't happen to us. Surely we won't ever have to choose between fitting in and living according to God's will. Surely we won't have to choose between human favor and pleasing God. Surely we won't have to do that. Of course we will. Of course we will. Because it's always Babylon. This story isn't as distant from us as we think. Daniel had to choose, am I gonna please the people around me, or am I gonna keep doing what I have always done? I pray 3 times a day for as long as I can remember. Maybe I could put it off for a little while. Maybe I could do it at a different time. Maybe I could close the windows. Am I gonna choose to fit in with other people? Or am I going to choose to continue serving God the way I have always served God? Fact of the matter is, we're going to have to make the same choices. When we have to choose between our kids' hobbies and doing worship the way we've always done it, what will we choose? When we have to choose between our hobbies and doing worship the way we've always done it, what will we choose? When we have to choose between our jobs, and doing worship the way we've always done it, what will we choose? Sometimes we're so worried about fitting in because I think we've got it in our minds, well, America's a Christian nation anyway, so I'm just going to fit in with everyone else. It's Babylon. But we don't want to fit in with that city. And so that's something that we need to remember, and I think we see that here in these opening verses of Daniel. It is Babylon. It is always Babylon. Let's move on. Verses, I know it says verses 10 through 18. We're going to do verses 11 through 18 since we already read verse 10. So picking up in verse 11. It says, "Then these men went as a group and found Daniel petitioning and imploring his God. So they approached the king and asked about his edict. 'King, didn't you sign an edict that for 30 days any person who petitions any god or man except you, the king, will be thrown into the lion's den?' The king answered, 'As a law of the Medes and Persians, the order stands and is irrevocable.' Then they replied to the king, 'Daniel, one of those Judean exiles, has ignored you, the king, and the edict you signed, for he prays 3 times a day.' As soon as the king heard this, he was very displeased. He set his mind on rescuing Daniel and made every effort until sundown to deliver him. Then these men went together to the king and said to him, 'You know, your majesty, that it is a law of the Medes and Persians that no edict or ordinance that the king established can be changed.'" And so, the king's kind of slow walking this. He doesn't want to throw Daniel into the lion's den, and the people see it, and the rulers are like, you've written this into the law. They sort of back him into a corner. Verse 16. "So the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, 'May your God, whom you continually serve, rescue you.' And a stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den. The king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the signet ring of his nobles, so that nothing in regard to Daniel could be changed. Then the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting. No diversions were brought to him, and he could not sleep." One of the things that's evident in this context is that the king likes Daniel. The king is on Daniel's side. We mentioned earlier how the Persians seem to like the Jews. The Persians are the ones who allowed them to go home. Most scholars believe that King Darius is actually King Cyrus, because Cyrus is the one who defeated the Babylonians. Cyrus is the one who defeated Belshazzar and Nabonidus. And so most scholars believe that Darius is Cyrus, and Darius is just his royal name. And so if that's true, then what that means is Darius is the one who said to the Jews, go home and rebuild. And so Darius likes the Jews. He's on their side. Darius likes Daniel. He's on Daniel's side. As a matter of fact, the text says that he made every effort. He made every effort until sundown to release Daniel. And so I think the text makes it clear that Darius is clearly on Daniel's side. But let me ask, Where did Daniel end up? He ended up in the lion's den. Let me ask another question. What if Daniel had placed his trust in the king? He would have been sorely disappointed. As a matter of fact, I think that's one of the things that the text wants us to see. Let's read verses 16 through 18 again. And I want to ask you beforehand, so you're looking for it, who is the focus of verses 16 through 18? Let's read it again. So the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. And the king said to Daniel, "May your God, whom you continually serve, rescue you." A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den. The king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the signet rings of his nobles, so that nothing in regards to Daniel could be changed. Then the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting. No diversions were brought to him, and he could not sleep. Who's the main subject? Who's the focus of these verses? It's the king. It's not Daniel doesn't do or say anything in these verses. Everything is done or said to him. The focus of these verses is the king. And I believe the Holy Spirit wants us to see that the king could do nothing to save Daniel. If Daniel had placed his trust in the king, he would have been sorely disappointed. And so what's the lesson for us? Well, let's go to Psalm 146. Psalm 146, verse 3. And whenever you get there, just tell me the first line of verse 3. Whoever gets there first. Don't put your trust in princes. Thank you, Larry. That's the lesson for us. Don't put your trust in princes. Don't put your trust in senators, in presidents, and kings, and governors, and representatives. What does that look like? What does it look like when we place our trust in princes? Well, if I'm talking or posting more about politics and about Jesus, then maybe, just maybe, I've placed my trust in princes. If I have anger and contempt for our brethren who vote a different way, then maybe, just maybe, I've placed my trust in princes. If I think all of our problems are going to be fixed, man, if we could just get these people in office, fix all my problems, maybe we've placed our trust in princes. If I get more angry at the sins that my politician stands against, and not the other ones, maybe, just maybe, we've placed our trust in princes. Now, there's a reason why I'm bringing this up. Obviously, election day is this week. And we may be tempted to do what we're talking about, what's on the screen. We may be tempted to place our trust in politicians. Man, if we could just get these people in office, everything will be fine. If we can get our guys, the guys who are on our side into office, everything will be okay. Darius was on Daniel's side. How did that end up for him? Yeah, these politicians, they may be on our side, but they will watch as we walk into the lion's den. Do not put your trust in princes. That really leads to our next point. So let's pick up now in verse 19. Verse 19. It says, "At the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. When he reached the den, he cried out in anguish to Daniel. 'Daniel, servant of the living God,' the king said, 'has your God, whom you continually serve, been able to rescue you from the lions?' Then Daniel spoke with the king. 'May the king live for..'" Those would not be my first words to the king. Man, I read that and I'm so surprised. This guy threw you into the lion's den. Verse 21, again. "Then Daniel spoke with the king. 'May the king live forever. My God sent his angels and shut the lions' mouths, and they haven't harmed me. For I was found an innocent man before him, and also before you, your majesty. I have not done harm.' The king was overjoyed and gave orders to take Daniel out of the den. When Daniel was brought up from the den, he was found to be unharmed, for he trusted in his God. Then the king gave the command, and those men who had maliciously accused Daniel were brought and thrown into the lion's den, they, their children, and their wives. They had not reached the bottom of the den before the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. Then King Darius wrote to those of every people, nation, and language who live on the whole earth, 'May your prosperity abound. I have issued a decree that in all my royal dominion, people must tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will never be destroyed, and his dominion has no end. He rescues and delivers. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth, for he has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. So Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius, even the reign of Cyrus the Persian. And so here we see that King Darius understands something important. And I think we see this. The fact that King Darius even goes to the lion's den to check on Daniel means that he has at least some faith in Jesus. Because he had no faith in the God of Daniel, he wouldn't even gone. He has some faith in the God of Daniel. And then he sees Daniel, or hears Daniel. My God has delivered me. It's funny, the king was fasting, hoping Daniel would be okay. It turns out that the lions were fasting as well. And Daniel was just fine. And so he sees, he hears, yes, I'm okay. And so he makes this bold proclamation. God is the living God, and he endures forever. And so the king couldn't save Daniel, but you know who could? God could. We may not place our trust in princes, but our God saves. So Daniel was saved by his God, and then Daniel was removed from the lion's den, and the enemies of Daniel were punished. And then after that, the king of Persia proclaims with his mouth, the living God is the God who Daniel serves. And so the lesson for us, salvation belongs to the Lord. Salvation belongs to the Lord. You know, if you pay attention to this episode in Daniel, Daniel's deliverance really foreshadows everyone's deliverance. It foreshadows my deliverance, and it foreshadows your deliverance. We talked about how Daniel was saved not by princes, not by kings, but by God. And then his enemies were punished. And then the king proclaimed with his mouth, your God is the living God. Well, that happens on our day of deliverance as well. When God returns, his people will be saved, delivered, just like Daniel was. When God returns, his enemies will be punished, just like Daniel's enemies were punished. And when God returns, every knee will bow, and every tongue will confess that Jesus is Lord, just like Darius confessed that Daniel's God really is Lord. And so what's the lesson? Salvation belongs to the Lord. So we need to be with him. Ultimately, overall, the book of Daniel teaches us that God rules. God is in charge in the kingdoms of men. There may be some arrogant kings who think they're in charge, who think they hold all the power, but God is the one who really is in charge, and God is the one who really is the author of the story. And so we may live in a time where wicked people conspire against us as God's people, but you know what? It's going to be okay because God is in charge. We may live in a world that very much feels like Babylon. It'll be okay because our God is in charge and salvation belongs to him. That's the lesson. Thank you for listening. Maybe there's someone here this morning who realizes now that salvation belongs to God. And so you want to be on his side. If there's someone who wants to become a child of God through faith, repentance, baptism, ultimately allegiance to Jesus, we'd love to help you with that this morning. Or maybe there's someone who's left the Lord, they've went to live in the world, placed their trust in everybody and everything but God, and you want to return. We'd love to help you with that. If you need to respond to the invitation, you can do so now as we stand and as we sing.